Hey, welcome to Junior Youth Sundays. My name is Justin, and today, my friend Colin is finishing up our series, Flex. We've been in it for a few weeks now, but we're finishing up, so grab your notebooks, grab your Bibles, and we will get this thing going.
All right, good morning, Junior Youth. I hope you're all doing well. I can't believe that the summer is almost over. I feel like it's gone by so fast, but I hope you've had an amazing summer holiday and just getting ready to go back to school. Just know that we're praying for you as you're just in the process of getting school started again in September. What we're doing today is we are finishing our series called Flex. And essentially in this series, we've been looking at the life of Samson and just learning what are things that we could take away from his life and apply to our own walks with Jesus. So if you missed last week, I highly recommend that you make sure that you watch that video first because Tyson, he brought an amazing message and he just talked about this reality that when we choose to make bad choices or when we choose to follow this path of sin, eventually our sin finds us out. And he talked about the story of Samson, how essentially what happened was as a Nazirite, he wasn't supposed to have his hair cut. And essentially what happened was that Delilah had convinced him to be able to tell her where his power came from. And he ended up getting his hair cut. And unfortunately, this was the haircut that ended things for him. And what happened was that the power of the Lord had left him. And essentially the Philistines took him over and he's just in this horrible spot where his bad choices and his compromises eventually caught up to him. So Judges chapter 16, we're just going to start off by reading verses 22 to 25, and we'll dive in from there. So this is what it says, starting at verse 22. But the hair on his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. Now the rulers of the Philistines assembled to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and began to celebrate, saying, "Our God has delivered Samson, our enemy, into our hands." When the people saw him, they praised their God, saying, "Our God has delivered our enemy into our hands, the one who laid waste our land and multiplied our slain." While they were in high spirits, they shouted, "Bring out Samson to entertain us." So they called Samson out of the prison, and he performed for them. So Samson in this moment, he's chained up, he's not in a good place, and essentially his sin had caught up to him. Back when I was 16, I remember I was hanging out with a bunch of my friends and they decided that they thought it would be really funny to pull a prank. Now, I don't know if you're into pranks, but this prank was definitely a dumb one. What my friends decided to do is they thought it'd be really, really funny to go and egg this bus that drove by my friend's school every day. So what happened was my buddies, they went to the local store and they bought a dozen eggs and then they went out and hung out by the bus stop waiting for the bus to come. Now there's like this forest that was by like the bus stop, and like what they would do is they'd hide out and they'd wait to hear the sound of the bus coming. So they would just hear the sound of the bus coming, and they would start counting down. 3, 2, 1. As soon as the bus came out, they started whipping these eggs at the side of the bus. They thought it was the funniest thing ever. And, they're laughing and they're just thinking it's just a fun old time. And what would happen is the bus would start to speed up and would drive away as fast as it could. So, of course, my buddies think that this is absolutely hilarious. So they decide to go and get some more eggs. So the next day they go to the store, they buy another dozen eggs, and then they wait for the bus. So they're sitting there and they're waiting, and all of a sudden they hear the sound of the bus. 3, 2, 1. They start whipping these eggs at the side of the bus again. They're laughing. They're just thinking it's the funniest thing. The bus drives away again. So then what happens is they do that again the next day. And they do it again the next day. And then there's this one day where they decide, you know what would be really funny? Let's get 2 dozen eggs and let's whip them all at this bus. So they go to the store, and instead of getting 1 dozen eggs, they get 2 dozen eggs, and they decide to wait at their spot until the bus comes again. So they're sitting there and they're waiting, and they're waiting, and then all of a sudden they hear the bus coming. 3, 2, 1. And then all of a sudden, they start whipping these eggs at the side of the bus, right? And they're laughing, they're whipping these eggs, but then all of a sudden, things take a bit of a shift. And then the bus goes, the bus stopped. And all of a sudden, my friends are kind of in a panic. They're like, okay, this is kind of weird. And all of a sudden, the bus doors open, and this big angry, sweaty man starts running out of the bus and starts screaming, "I'm gonna kill you kids!" And he starts booking it after my friends. So of course my friends were like, this is not how things were supposed to go. So they start booking it into the forest and they were running as fast as they can. They left the eggs, they left the cartons, they just booked it as fast as they could. And they're running away from this guy because I mean, like, this bus driver, I think, was probably gonna try to kill these guys. So like, they're running as fast as they can, they're booking it. And essentially what happened was they found a bunch of bushes and trees that had been knocked over and they hide behind the trees. So they're hiding there and then they can hear him like, and they're, like they're just panicking. They're hiding behind the trees, trying to be as quiet as possible. And they can hear him running back and forth and back and forth. And they're just waiting for him to go away. Well, here's the thing is that essentially like the bus, like, I mean, he couldn't leave it running forever. So he just yells out to my friends, like, the next time you guys do this, you guys are going to get in so much trouble. So he books off and then, my friends are waiting and then they can hear the bus doors close. And then the bus goes away. And then they just take a sigh of relief and they start laughing, right? They're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that we got away with this. We got away with this egging thing. Let's do it again tomorrow. So they think it's going to be the funniest thing to do it again tomorrow because, I mean, if they didn't get caught this time, they probably won't get caught next time. So they decide to, like, they leave the forest and they're planning for the next day thinking this is going to be the funniest thing ever if they do this again. So they're walking away from the forest and they start walking towards the school and then all of a sudden, whoop, whoop, a bunch of cop cars roll up. My friends were busted. They were caught red-handed. They thought they got away with what they were doing, but eventually their sin caught up with them. Essentially, they experienced the consequences of it. They got in trouble with the police. They had to write apology letters to the bus driver themselves, and they had to do some community service hours just to make up for what they did. Sometimes in life, when we make these bad decisions, when we choose this life of sin, essentially our sin catches up to us. And eventually we end up facing the consequences. And that's where we find Samson in this story here. Because when we look at the life of Samson, the way that he lived his life, the thing about Samson is that he didn't end up in this place overnight. The reality about Samson is one bad decision after another. It was one small compromise after another. The thing about Samson's life, and we talked about this in the first week, is that Samson had everything going for him. His parents were faithful, godly people. And when it came to this Nazirite vow, for him to be set apart for the work that God wanted to do in his life, they did everything they could to set him up for success. But the thing about Samson and the way that he chose to live his life, he chose to disregard what his parents had to say. And he made one small compromise after another. And then essentially what happened is that this is where he ended up. He ended up beaten up, blind, and just at the end of the day, super, super broken. And I know for some of us, this might seem really extreme, right? Like, I mean, maybe we're not in the same situation as Samson, but I think there's some things that we can relate to as well. Because maybe for some of us, we're making small compromises in our life that we don't think are going to make a big difference, but they're going to lead us down a path that we don't want to go. Maybe for us, there's a lie that we've told, and in order to make up for that lie, we end up telling another lie. And then we end up telling another lie. Then all of a sudden, we don't even know what the truth is anymore. And our life is filled with lies and we don't know which way to go and we don't know when to fess up and we feel stuck. Maybe it's one small compromising decision after another. Like maybe there's a friend that you know from school that maybe you shouldn't be spending time with because they're a bad influence on you. And over a series of just like small opportunities of hanging out with that person, you notice that you start doing things that you shouldn't end up doing. You're going to places that you shouldn't end up going. And all of a sudden, you're becoming a person that you thought you would never end up becoming. Or maybe for you, there's these choices that you're starting to make and you know that they're not necessarily good for you, but then all of a sudden they're starting to become habits. And then those habits are starting to be harder and harder to break. And then essentially those habits end up becoming an addiction. And it gets to the point where you don't know how to stop. At the end of the day, the choices that we make and the decisions that we decide to follow through on, essentially they lead us down a certain path. And the path that they lead us down isn't necessarily where we want to go. And when we look at look at the story of Samson and his life and where he ended up, Samson, he's chained up. Like we said, he's blind, he's weak, he's broken. And when we choose to live our lives on our own terms, instead of doing what God wants us to do, at the end of the day, we end up the same way. We end up spiritually blind. We end up weak. And we end up making decisions that we're not supposed to be doing. And we reap the consequences of that. Now, although this situation looks really bleak for Samson, and although at the end of the day, this looks like, it's really dark, that this is the end, the thing is that this is not where the story ends. The enemies of Samson, what they fail to realize is that although they think they defeated Samson, what they don't understand is that his hair, the strength that came from his hair, it wasn't from, the hair itself. The thing they forget to understand is that the reason Samson got his strength is because of the God that he actually made vows to. There's this quote by this guy named Tim Keller, and he explains this situation so well, and this is what he says. The Philistines knew nothing of the God who does the unexpected, whose strength is made perfect in weakness, and who never breaks his word. That God did say that Samson would be a Nazirite to the day of his death. His abandonment of his servants could not be but temporary. The promise was bound to hold, however Samson might despair it. There is grace abounding to the chief of sinners. And it says in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 13, if we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. So let's continue the story where things take a little bit of a shift. And we're going to read Judges chapter 16, verses 26 to 31. Samson said to the servant who held his hand, put me where I can feel the pillars that support the temple so that I may lean against them. Now the temple was crowded with men and women. All the rulers of the Philistines were there, and on the roof were about 3,000 men and women watching Samson perform. Then Samson prayed to the Lord, Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please God, strengthen me just once more, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. Then Samson reached toward the 2 central pillars on which the temple stood, bracing himself against them, his right hand on one and the left hand on the other. Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. Then he pushed with all his might, and down came the temple on the rulers and all the people in it. Thus he killed many more when he died than when he lived. Then his brothers and his father's whole family went down to get him. They brought him back and buried him between Zorah and Eshtal in the tomb of Manoah, his father. He had led Israel for 20 years. So once again, you guys, if you think the Bible's boring, you just haven't read the Bible, because this story is crazy. Unfortunately, the most meaningful part of Samson's life resulted in his death. But the thing that we have to remember about this story is that when Samson cried out to God, when Samson got to the point of being at the end of himself, God listened to his prayer. And the thing that I want us to remember from this story is this, that no matter how far we've gone, no matter how much we've messed up, no matter how bad we think our situation is, we can always run back to God. There's this idea in the Bible called repentance, and what it means is it's when we turn away from our sin and we feel remorse for our sin. Obviously we feel bad for what we've done, but what we can do is we can actually turn away from our sin and we can run towards God. We can experience God's forgiveness, and the reason for it is because of what Jesus has done for us on the cross. Because at the end of the day, Jesus needed to be the true hero of our story. There's this reality of sin that we see in the world around us. We saw it in Samson's life. And if we're honest, we see it in our own life. And because of this reality of sin, Jesus came down to earth to live the perfect life that we can never live. He died on the cross. And based on what Jesus did for us, we can experience forgiveness with God. So the thing that I want to encourage us with when it comes to this whole series of Samson is I think there's a main thought that we could kind of process through. And that's to choose to lean on God in all that we do. In Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 to 6, it says, trust in the Lord with all of your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all of your ways, acknowledge him, and he will set your path straight. So when it comes to our lives and how we choose to live our life, I think the thing that we can take away from Samson and his life is when we choose to do things that are right in our own eyes, when we want to do things our way instead of God's way, it ultimately leads to our destruction. So the thing that I want to encourage each and every one of us is to trust God, to make Jesus first in our lives, and to trust wherever he leads us to go. Junior Youth, so thankful you joined us for our series on Flex, and we're going to be starting a new series next week, but just know that you're so loved, and yeah, we'll see you next time. Take care.
Thank you so much, Colin, for that very encouraging message. We are done our series Flex. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Hey, if you want to get connected with us at Junior Youth, or if you just want to know more information about what we're doing at Village Youth, you guys can email us right here at villageyouth@thisisvillagechurch.com. We will see you guys next time.